Hello, welcome back to the channel. We're going to be looking at a creepypasta reading today. But before we jump into it, I do want to give out some trigger warnings. The story I am about to read for you all is quite graphic, and it is purely fiction. But I do warn you, it is quite graphic. So proceed with caution. Thank you. I just want to start off by saying that if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. However, what I will say is that the things I saw during this experience haunt me to this very day. I was an intern at DHX Studios for a year in 2013 in order to pursue my animation degree. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't. But it did have some good perks. To some, it might not seem like a big one, but most pony-loving kids and bronies at the time would have shit themselves over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and animators of the cartoon, I got to view the new episodes long before they actually aired on television. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. At the time, they had very recently finished Season 3 of My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, so the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, and it took them longer to start up the next season. They had written the Season 3 finale as the series finale, and most of them did not anticipate that Hasbro would order a fourth season to be produced. Now, many of you may know that no My Little Pony episodes premiered between February and November of 2013, a hiatus of 9 months. It's often thought this was because the studio had their hands full working on a theatrical film, My Little Pony Equestria Girls, but this actually wasn't the reason for it at all. What is not known is that the delay lasted longer than planned for sure. Unsettling reasons. There was a problem with the Season 4 premiere of the show that set everyone and everything back for several months, and ended up pushing the season's premiere back by almost a year. Me and some other interns were in the editing room along with the lead animators and sound editors, waiting to see the final cut of the newest episode. We received the copy that was supposed to be Princess Twilight Sparkle, Part 1, and gathered around our TV screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put up a mock title card, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles, such as Miss Cake's Affair instead of Baby Cakes, when Mr. and Mrs. Cake have unicorn and Pegasus foals, despite themselves both being Earth ponies. Nothing particularly funny, but enough to make us chuckle. So when we saw the title card, SOMBRA'S Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke at first. However, I myself was slightly curious about the specific character whose name was mentioned in the phony title. I wasn't a huge fan of the show, but I did know that the villain King Sombra had been, rather gruesomely, killed off by Twilight Sparkle and her friends in the Season 3 premiere. Would he somehow be returning for revenge in Season 4? One of the interns let out a small throat laugh at the edgy title card. The episode started with the theme song, which was somewhat strange, because usually there is a prologue scene before it that sets the story in motion. However, nothing seemed to be wrong with the theme song itself. I assumed that maybe the beginning scene just hadn't been added in yet. The story began in what appeared to be the Crystal Empire. However, it looked grim and bleak. Nothing like what you'd expect to see in the opening of a light-hearted kids show. Instead of being a light blue, the sky was a sickly shade of dark orange. The sun was nowhere to be seen, despite it appearing to be daytime. The screen first showed the entirety of the Empire, and then the camera slowly zoomed in on the Crystal Castle, which was just as ominous looking as the buildings surrounding it. It then cut to the balcony, high up in the castle. There was King Sombra, and I immediately realized that this episode must have been showing the time in which he ruled over the crystal ponies. Sombra was standing on the balcony, looking out over his kingdom, and a crowd of ponies who had gathered at the base of the castle. He did not look very pleased, and actually appeared to be quite depressed. His long, black mane was matted, his scarlet cape was tattered, and his eyes had bags under them like he hadn't slept in days. We then hear one of Sombra's guards ask him if everything is alright, and Sombra responds by screaming viciously at the guard and telling him to get out of his sight. The guard obeys and hurries back into the castle, clearly terrified. While the scene was a little disturbing and not very entertaining at all to watch, it wasn't the darkest or strangest thing I had ever seen in a kids show before. However, in the next moment, Sombra gives a speech to his subjects. This is when things begin to seem really off. Sombra starts rambling about how great of a leader he is, and how he promises to bring great wealth and prosperity to the citizens of his empire. Just generic, pompous, evil overlord crap. While speaking, a few frames of his lip movements repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, sound is synced up with animation, so yes, that's not common. And when he stops, the sound continues as if the skip never happened, causing him to speak even when his mouth isn't moving. I narrowed my eyes, somewhat perplexed. An animation mistake this obvious should not have made it this far into production. There is slight murmuring in the crowd of ponies before they begin to angrily scream and boo at Sombra. Not normal booing that is common in cartoons, but you could very clearly hear malice and contempt in it. Sombra's in full frame and looks visibly afraid, which is unlike him. What is also strange is that the main six can actually be seen in the crowd as well, booing viciously at Sombra, even though the episode supposedly took place thousands of years before any of them were born. That isn't the oddest thing, though. What is very odd is that everyone in the crowd has hyper-realistic eyes, very detailed, clearly not shots of real people's or ponies' eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. It did not fit at all with the show's usual flash animation style. The pupils were red and looked unsettling on the faces of those normally sweet and cheerful ponies. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused and bewildered. But since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children yet. And I personally didn't mind seeing Sombra get treated like that after the way he had yelled at his guard before. The screen slowly fades to black after showing Sombra's frightened face. I assumed this would have been the beginning of a commercial break. The story then resumes and shows Sombra sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. He has removed his crown, cape, and armor, revealing a body that is covered in scars and sores. His face looks bruised as if he had been in a fight, and one of his ears, which is usually not visible, has been bandaged up. The view out of his chamber window is of a night sky, so it must have been a while after he gave his speech. The unsettling part is at this point there is no sound at all. Literally no sound. Not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. Sombra just sits there, blinking, in utter silence for about 30 seconds. Then he starts to sob. He puts his hooves over his eyes and starts to cry quietly for a full minute more. All the while, a sound in the background very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze moving through a forest. Even though I had known Sombra as one of the most vile villains to be featured on the show at that point, I could not help but feel terrible for the Unicorn King. His despair and anguish in that moment felt almost like that of a real person instead of a cartoon pony. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on his bruised, wounded face. By slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at shots 10 seconds apart side by side. It zooms in so close that you can see the details of the fur on his face. His sobbing gets progressively louder, more full of hurt and anger. There is then a bit of static for a split second. The wind through the trees, sound gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is the sound, and Sombra's sobbing. It sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers themselves, but as if the speakers were holes the sound was coming out of. It sounded like everything was happening for real. As good a sound as the studio likes to have, I knew that their equipment wasn't even remotely capable of producing sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, something very faint that sounds like laughing can be heard. It came at odd intervals, and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had plenty of time to think about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and distorted violently, and something flashed over the screen, as if a single frame was replaced. The LED animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame. What he saw was horrible. It was a still photo of what appeared to be a child. He couldn't have been more than 6, and it was obvious he was dead. The face was mangled and bloodied. One eye dangling over his upturned face popped. His stomach crudely cut open, and his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It would seem the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were, of course, mortified, but pressed on, hoping that it was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Sombra, still sobbing, louder than before, and half body and frame. There was now what appears to be blood running down his face from his glowing green eyes. The blood was also done in a hyper-realistic style, looking as if you touched it, you'd get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if it were that of a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches. The laughing, a female voice that sounded familiar to the laughter of Nightmare Moon from the series premiere, lasting at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but he knew he had to. This time the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She too had been murdered. She was laying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was too popped out, and popped. Her entrails were piled on top of her, above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible. Very similar in size and shape to the first. I had the choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Sombra went silent, as did all sound, like it was when the scene started. He put his hooves down and his eyes were now done in hyper-realism, like the eyes of the other characters were in the beginning of this episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. Looking at them made me nauseous. He just stared at the screen, as if watching the viewer. There was almost a sort of pleading look on his face, like he could see us and thought we could somehow help him. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all is his sobbing was mixed with screams and shrieks. It sounded as though the unicorn was in complete agony. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the nightmare moon laughing. And this time the still photo lasted for 5 good frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and backed up. This time the photo was of a boy, about the same age, but this time the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out from a stomach wound by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. He went on to the next, same thing. He went back to the first and played them quicker, and I lost it. I vomited on the floor, the animating and sound editors gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lifting out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of a kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the show's original creator to see this. Miss Faust arrived within about 15 minutes. She was confused as to why she was called down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Sombra was just staring at the viewer, full frame of the face, for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out and that voice said, "Do it." And then we see in Sombra's hooves a photorealistic sword. He immediately plunged the weapon into his stomach and yanked it back out again, all the while with blood and body fluids splurting everywhere. He then stabs the wound through his eye and yanks it out again, causing the eye to pop out of his head. Realistic blood and brain matter covers the sword and flies through the air around him. He drops the sword and it clatters on the floor. Drops of blood spray on his bed, and he then slumps onto the bed as he dies. The last 5 seconds of this episode show his body on the bed, on his side, the one eye dangling out from his mutilated and bloodied head, still glowing a bright green and staring as a fly buzzes and lands atop of it, and more flies land on his stomach wound. The episode then cuts to black, and some words appear, reading "Long live the king" in a messy, handwritten script. Then the episode ends. Miss Faust was obviously angry at this. She demanded to know what the hell was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us who remained behind to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind and caused me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyze when it happened. The analysis of the file did show it had indeed been tampered with and edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have glitched and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. None of us can comprehend what we saw, or what kind of sick bastard might have come up with this thing in the first place. Most of all, what could have driven somebody to create such a demented and horrific corruption of a sweet and innocent children's cartoon? Was it a former animator who did it out of spite over being fired, or a sick, practical joke created for fun that got accidentally loaded onto the file? But who the hell would find something like this funny? Given that the episode heavily featured King Sombra, could it have been an angry fanatic of the show who despised the character? Or was somehow madly obsessed with him? I don't think we will ever get an answer. There was an investigation due to the nature of the disturbing photos, but nothing came of it. No child seen was identified and no clues were gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I have had something incredibly bizarre happen, and I can't prove anything about it beyond anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things, and I never, ever want to see another episode of My Little Pony with King Sombra in it as long as I live.